Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War News Geopolitics video. I did one earlier today that was from yesterday. This is catching up, so I've purged myself, or I will have purged myself of all of the information I'm going to share with you on the Ukraine war and things pertaining to it. We're going to start with what I think is a really interesting little quote, or little nugget that gives us a route into our first discussion point. So this is Kate from Kharkiv, says Ukraine never votes for far-right parties. Europe, Ukraine has a far-right problem. Also Europe votes for far-right parties. This is such a strong point, right? One of the big sticking points, which is playing into the Russian narrative, the Russian propaganda point, is that Ukraine is this Nazi nation full of far-right ideologues and activists, when the reality is they've had a lower percentage of votes for far-right parties than pretty much, I think it's than every European country. And so, like, empirically, this appears to be false. Like, literally, there is no far-right representation in Ukraine, and yet in many countries around Europe we have a 15% plus rate of voting for far right. Ukraine has had under 3%. So when I said there's no representation, they don't have any seats, and it's about less than 3% of the vote. That is like 5 times that around Europe, as according to the last vote. So anyone from Europe, I'm not talking about Russia, and you can't really look at Russia because they don't have voting, they don't have proper elections there. But anyone in Europe that gives you the argument that Ukraine is some kind of hotbed for far-right ideology, just hold up a mirror, right? It's an absolute non-argument. Now, Zelensky's been in Germany today, where he's been at the Ukraine Recovery Conference, and he's met with Olaf Scholz. He's met with all sorts of people. I saw him talking with Mark Rutte earlier, and so on and so forth. Now, he also spoke in the Bundestag, which is a German parliament. Now, get a load of this. Right, he spoke at the Bundestag, but this is how low you can get, says Fidelia Schmidt. Members of the pro-Russian parties, the right-wing AfD and the, albeit smaller, Linke spin-off BSW, boycott Zelensky's speech in the German Bundestag. So not only does Ukraine not have a right-wing, like a far-right problem in their own parliamentary democracy and in their own society, like to the degree, remotely to the degree that's been accused by outsiders. But, you know, when Zelensky goes to speak at parliaments in places like, and this happened in Austria as well, here it's in Germany, then the far right doesn't even turn up, and the far left. But it's just like kind of hypocrisy really irritates me, and I think it's quite poignant, that as well. And you know, what does that tell you about the far right and far left in Germany? If they boycott that speech, then all they're doing is saying, we are connected to Russia, we are pro-Russia. So that's all I can see that is communicating, which is to fulfill all of the accusations that are levelled against them. During his speech at the Bundestag, Zelensky speaks of, quote, thousands of saved Ukrainian lives by the Patriot battery supplied by Germany. But in all of his speeches today, you could feel the pain and realise how much more is still needed, says German aid to Ukraine, who obviously listened to his speeches. I haven't listened to his speeches. After the speech, there was a long-lasting standing ovation until the Ukrainian president left the hall. So that's really nice from the mainstream political landscape parties in Germany, that there is such a full-throated support for him. It's just the AfD suck, and BSW suck. You know, Sarah Wagenknecht, who is the former Der Linke, the left parliamentarian or politician who is now heading up the BSW, is just as pro-Russian. European Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen believes that the EU Commission's president believes the EU should begin accession talks with Ukraine already in June. Now, I'm wondering whether Ursula von der Leyen is thinking, right, okay, we just had elections, things are looking a bit rocky, we're going to have a whole load of new politicians coming in, so just before they find their feet, considering there's this surge of the far right, and I was having an argument with someone on my threads who was saying, actually, there's not that much of a surge of the far right. If you look at the seats and the numbers and blah, 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 etc., etc. Look at the votes, but look at also, one of the accusations was, look, you don't know what you're talking about. When the Tories were in this particular group in the EU, you know, it was, and the idea was, he was saying that the British Conservatives, when they were in the EU Parliament, were just as right wing, and the numbers haven't really changed. I'm like, no. When the British Conservatives were there, they weren't, like, don't accuse me of not knowing what I'm talking about. British Conservatives then were not super right wing. You did have Euroscepticism, but you had an awful lot of moderate conservatism of Europhiles. And I could name you a number of those, from Heseltine to good old Kenneth, what's his name? I said I could name him, but my brain has just left me. Kenneth Clark. And so, you know, but what's interesting is, since then, and this is a really good analogue, since then in the UK, the Conservative Party has gone through this fracturing where it has shifted largely to the right. And what you're seeing in the general election at the moment is that it's having a bit of an identity crisis, because it's getting pressured by some of these parliamentarians on the right, like Kemi Badenoch, Suella Braverman, Priti Patel, Rees-Mogg, these people that are urging the Conservative Party to go to, because it's being threatened by reform on the right, and saying, look, Nigel Farage is over here, we need to be more like Nigel Farage to get into government. And then you've got the centrists going, no, we don't need to do that, we need to adopt the centre ground, the centre-right ground, so that we appeal to more of the general population of the UK, so that we're more electorally attractive. But what has happened is, undeniably, at least part of our Conservative Party has moved to the further to the right. And that's happened in the last 10 years, right? But back when he was talking about, anyway, point being is, my larger point is that the EU is doing that as well, or the European Parliament, is that it's not just that there is a surge to the far right, or there are some more far right seats than there were. And if you take into account the coalitions and a number of non-aligned MEPs at the moment, but also some of the like the ECR group that used to have the Conservative Party in them has become more Brothers of Italy. Now, although the Brothers of Italy under Giorgia Meloni have started off kind of quite fascist, they've gone, or neo-fascist as some say, they've gone a little bit more moderate. But the point is that the kind of more moderate, well, slightly further to the right, but fairly moderate coalition of right-wing MEPs in the EU has it ideologically shifted more to the right. So it's not just about looking at how many seats went to what MEPs, but also whether some of those groups themselves that have remained those groups have just themselves ideologically shifted. And I would argue that has been happening, as we can see in different countries in Europe. And I think this is a reflection of what is going on just politically in general, as we become more and more polarized and divided. And this is what's going on in the US, where you have the Democrats that I think adopt the centre to the centre left, slight centre left, and you have the Republicans that are right wing, but you've got the MAGA Republicans really trying to draw the Republicans to the right. You can argue you've got some Justice Democrats trying to drag the party to the left. But I think you've got this polarization that's happening in the United States. It's happening in all the countries in Europe, I think, to some degree or another. And so it's not just the parties, these new sort of right-wing, super right-wing parties that are gaining popularity, but it's the popularity of a certain type of right-wing ideology that is gaining momentum in already established parties. Anyway, yeah. So there you go. So and I think that's important to note. Right. Okay. So talking about the EU elections, we have also seen on the far left. So you also have in certain elements of the far left, and we saw this with BSW in Germany, and as mentioned, Sarah Wagenknecht. We have two Irish left wingers, Mick Wallace and Claire Daly. These are the classic anti-US imperialism type left wingers who go, right, I don't like American imperialism, but instead of being nuanced about that, saying, oh, there's elements of that I don't like, but actually I'd much rather that than the alternative, which appears to be China and Russia, they go, we don't like American imperialism, therefore we like Russia and China. And they jump from one to the other, rather than sitting somewhere more sensible and critiquing that initial position. And so these guys have just been kind of having dodgy opinions on Syria, appearing to be supportive of anything China and Russia does. And it is good news that they are no longer in the European Parliament. They didn't get the votes in the Irish European elections. Now, the Czech Prime Minister Petr Fiala has said, moving off the EU elections, a failed arson attack that took place in Prague last week was very likely organised and financed by Russia. So I was talking about fire being a very easy tool. We've seen it harnessed by the Ukrainians inside Russia, paying off Russians to burn things down. I think has been happening. There's been insurance jobs. There's been all sorts going on in Russia, but I think Ukraine is behind at least some of them. And I've worried for a long time, but I haven't really talked about it too openly because I didn't want to give anyone ideas. But actually, it's been now publicly talked about that the Russians are trying to get people to set fire to stuff in Europe. And it happened at the Polish hypermarket recently, that massive mall, the biggest mall in the country burnt down, 1,400 shops or whatever it was. So now very likely, which is, if it's the US, I think that's over 80% probability. I think the UK is 75% for very likely. There are different percentages accorded to these intelligence statements. So when people say likely and very likely, it's not just a throwaway statement. It's certainly in intelligence analysis has a modal quantification accorded. So yeah, that's pretty damning for Russia here, that they are almost certainly behind an organised, or certainly behind organising and financing arson attacks in Czechia there. Prime Minister Donald Tusk announced the creation of a buffer zone on the border of Poland and Belarus. Who would have thought we'd be here 5 years ago? We are now creating military buffer zones inside Europe to the countries bordering Europe, Belarus in this case. We're talking about... sorry, children ringing the doorbell, getting home from school. I lost my train of thought there completely. So anyway... we are talking about several tens of kilometres, 200 metres deep. There are places in the natural reserves where this zone will be up to 2 kilometres deep, but those will be short sections, said Donald Tusk. These are the results of the meeting of the Security Council and the government, according to Polish media. The meeting began with a minute of silence in memory of Polish border guard Mateusz, who died from an injury he received in a clash with migrants at the border. So this is as a result of Belarus supposedly motivating migrants to go to the border and cause all sorts of issues around barbed wire areas, around these sort of border areas you can see in the image below. And I believe there was someone that had attached a knife to a stick or something like that and stabbed a border guard through the fence. I think that's what happened, and he died unfortunately later. So yeah, they've endured 50 attacks, it says here. So the claim is that these migrants have been put up to this by the Belarusians. Now, this has been an ongoing claim since 2015 or something like that, when this started happening. So there's been a lot of this over time. The Baltic nations have supposedly an issue with this as well. And then, of course, there are the accusations from Finland at Russia for doing similar stuff. Now, talking about Poland, I don't know why it's taken this long, but thank goodness this is happening. So Poland and the US are launching a group that's set up to tackle Russian disinformation on Ukraine. My goodness, this is absolutely needed. Rubin said the group, involving around a dozen Western representatives, would be based at a foreign ministry location in the Polish capital. Countries that have agreed to participate include Ukraine, Canada, Finland, France, Germany, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Slovenia, Rubin told reporters. He added that NATO and European External Action Service, EU's foreign diplomacy arm, would also participate. We believe that getting a group of people for the first time in a room, 10, 11 people sitting together with their government support, will improve our ability to respond to Russia's information warfare about the Ukraine war. Yes, yes, yes. Why has it taken so long? You've got cyber attacks, information attacks, propaganda just infiltrating our brains. And as soon as we turn on our social media apps, it's so frustrating. Right, this made me raise an eyebrow or six. It was one of the most, memorable here. So it's Alexander Commission, who's top-knot man, who's now in charge of strategic industries, getting drones ready and all sorts of stuff like that. Minister of Strategic Industries. So it was one of the most memorable meetings I've had during this war. It was an honour to meet the defence minister at the railway station at midnight on her way to Kyiv. Things are cooking, but will be announced soon. What is going on there? So I told you that Kaja Ollongren, the Dutch defence minister, did a surprise visit to Ukraine, and here's Commission talking about that, but dropping a real cryptic "things are cooking, but will be announced soon." Goodness knows what that concerns. I mean, the Dutch have been so supportive, doing so much stuff. It's been absolutely incredible. It could be something to do with air defences. I don't know what a big significant announcement could be. Aircraft, air defences. I don't know, or maybe instructors inside Ukraine, something like that. Right, diplomats of the Bucharest 9, the B9, a group of Central and Eastern European NATO allies, discussed the possibility of excluding Hungary from future meetings of the club, the Financial Times reported on June the 11th, citing undisclosed sources. Wow, if this is true, wow, wow, wow. We talked about Viktor Orban and Hungary being a problem for the EU and being a problem for NATO. You've got two options. Either you attract them, use a carrot or a stick, attract them in, or if you go hard on them, the problem is you push them out further into Russia's sphere of influence. Now, that's obviously dangerous, but there are constraints for Hungary since they are in the EU and they're in NATO. And if they go too far under Russia's influence, then they will be just kicked out of, certainly out of NATO, I would have thought. I don't know what the protocol is for doing something like that, but I would have thought it would be easier than for the EU. So Viktor Orban knows which side his bread is buttered, right? It's a corrupt country, but it gets a lot of funding from the EU. It needs to stay on side with the EU just enough, otherwise it's in trouble. If it's going to get kicked out of the EU and kicked out of NATO, his public will not be happy. And that 30% that Peter Magyar just got as an opposition leader that's just come out of nowhere, that 30% he's just got in the EU elections, and that minus 10% that the Fidesz party under Viktor Orban has just got, and its lowest vote numbers since goodness knows when. I think since they were first elected to the EU. He needs to read the tea leaves and think, right, either I stop being such a douchebag, or I go, or I double down, in which case that population ain't going to be happy. But also we lose influence, we lose military support. We'll go into Russia's sphere of influence. Oh, Russia, how can you help us? Oh, you've got no military that you can support us with because it's been absolutely trashed, and your military industrial capacity to build anything half decent is being, well, it's shown to be effectively untrue. Like S-400s can't take down ATACMs. So, if Hungary wants to go in that direction of travel, it has to realise that it won't end particularly well for it, unless they genuinely see Russia and China as this holy grail of where to go to, that it's somehow going to provide more employment and a better welfare state for it than the EU can do. So yeah, it's really interesting that many nations are wising up to Hungary's problematic positioning. Now, talking about NATO and benefits, this is really useful. I want to do a video on this at some point. Someone asked me explicitly once a long time ago. Is it because I was talking about Perun's excellent video on NATO and alliances and what the US gets out of NATO? And basically the idea that, yeah, the European nations need to pay more type thing does have validity, right? Europeans did need to pay more for their own defences, as we can see right now. We're kind of scrabbling to get back up to scratch. But it's the US effectively allowed that to happen because it came with advantages. So yeah, we're paying loads more than you, but actually it's part of the economic military strategy, and also we get to dictate stuff to you, and also we're getting stuff in return and trade deals, etc., etc. Discussed in a Perun video. Go and watch that. And Ben Hodges talks about this. So first of all, Barry McCaffrey says, so a fifth of the House Republicans just voted to defund NATO. I'd have to look at that. I don't know what the vote was on and whether the defund NATO was actually money that goes towards the NATO infrastructure. But actually, the funding for NATO is a bit of a misnomer. As I keep saying, it's about funding your own. You spend money on your own armed forces and defence, and that qualifies you for being a member of NATO. You don't spend all that much money on the NATO. It's not a thing. It's not a thing that you pay into so much. I mean, there will be nominal, there will be costs involved for its organisation and whatnot. But anyway, a fifth of House Republicans just voted to defund NATO. Legislation sponsored by Marjorie Taylor Greene. The chaos deepens. Our NATO alliance is the cornerstone of deterrence and peace. Europe and the US have massive common interests and values. It's madness. And General Ben Hodges, America benefits from NATO more than anybody. Our prosperity in the US is tied directly to European prosperity, our largest trading partner, which depends on stability and security in Europe. Thank you, NATO. Only 100,000 US military in Europe, just enough to fill Michigan's stadium. And so I think there's just a lack of understanding. And I'm no major knowledge on these things at all, but these are complicated matters that involved geopolitical strategies and that intermingle with economic and political and military and all these other strategies. They come together to lead one in America to think, hey, NATO is a good thing. We kind of created this thing for our own benefit as an alliance, and it still offers those benefits. And if we start trying to defund NATO, gee whiz, right? Marjorie Taylor Greene is just dim, I think. I just think, or she's just, I don't know, nationally suicidal. Just like, oh, how can we make America how can we make the US less influential and less powerful whilst also saying, let's make America great again? We're going to make America great again by getting out of NATO and spending money on a wall and then going and living in a hole in the ground. Yay! I live in a hole in the ground. Well done. Are we still top of the world? Are we top of the world? No, you're living in a pot full of piss underground. So sorry about that, Marjorie. Anyway, we're over here having a party. Just blows my mind. Anyway, mini rant over. Sorry about that. Marjorie Taylor Greene, just ugh. And Ben Hodges and Barry McCaffrey seem to know a little bit more about these things. Barry McCaffrey is for 23 years as a US Army general, retired, and then been doing media circuits and whatnot. Okay. Right. After the the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. So every year there's this economic forum in St. Petersburg, big kind of expo where Russia goes, look how cool we are, come and buy loads of our stuff. Oh, this is awesome. Aren't we amazing? Look, here's a robot that walks and here's a thing that's shiny. And people from around the world go around and going, that's really cool. Now, in the old days, I mean, probably before Putin invaded in the first place in 2014, but then before 2022, people from around the world were genuinely serious about going to that and deriving some benefit from turning up and signing contracts and whatnot. But it turns out, I think last year, no one signed any contracts on the back of that, no major ones. It's a bit of a damp squib. Here, Moldovan police detained passengers who flew from Russia to Chisinau airport. So Moldova's obviously got that connection to Russia. It's got Transnistria, where it's a hotbed for pro-Russian thinking. Anyway, they've arrested a bunch of people coming back from there. Russian propagandists claim that they were participants of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. One would assume it's just like you guys are basically willing agents for Russia. Anyway, that happened at the airport. But in terms of the International Economic Forum, apparently, according to Moscow Times, not a single major contract was concluded with foreigners. So I think that happened last year. I might be wrong, but if that's happened again, I mean, that's telling you something. You know, if you're for 2 weeks in a row, you've had a little stall outside your house trying to sell lemonade, homemade lemonade, and no one's bought it. You know, some people come up and taste it, but no one's bought any. Maybe it's either what you're offering is not very good, or you look like a mass murderer, and no one wants to buy lemonade off you. That's my analogy. It's poor, but I'm standing by it, or sitting by it selling lemonade. Right, Gazprom, talking about Russia and their economic outlook. Gazprom has signed contracts for gas deliveries to Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan until 2040. Previously, Gazprom showed very little interest in these markets, but now it plans to export up to 12 billion cubic meters of gas per year, but at a very low price. To transport the gas, the plan is to expand existing Soviet-era Central Asia Center gas pipeline and to expand it, as well as building additional gas transportation infrastructure in Kazakhstan. So it's taking an old pipeline that's probably a bit problematic, whacking a bunch of gas through it and then extending it and putting some extra infrastructure in place that I assume doesn't have that much capacity to try and sell as much stuff as they can because no one else is buying their gas. In October 2023, a contract was signed with Uzbekistan for the shipment of 3 billion cubic meters for a year, and by 2026 it's expected to increase to 11 billion cubic meters. The price in 2023 was $160 per 1 cubic meter, and 1.28 billion cubic meters were sold. In 2024, it's expected that 4 billion cubic meters will transit via Kazakhstan to Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan's own production is in decline due to depletion of its fields, and during winter, the country faces gas shortages. Russian supplies to Kyrgyzstan are relatively small at 0.34 billion cubic meters for 2023, and the country wants to expand this to 1 billion meters per year as Gazprom, Gazprom has 100 billion cubic meters in spare production. Any sale that is profitable is welcomed by the company. So this is slightly worrying that they are finding customers, but it's not huge custom and it's not at very decent prices for them. And they are, I think this is a sign of how desperate they are. So I don't think, had they not been involved in a war, Russia, Gazprom, I don't think would be doing this, right? You look at this as a kind of sense of where Gazprom are right now. From their height up there, it was a $200 billion company, and now it's merely $29 billion company with no bottom in sight, says Jay in Kiev. So yeah, Gazprom's in trouble. Plus, they're going to whack up taxes to Gazprom, which means it's going to be in even more trouble. So it needs to get as much business as it can, even if it's suboptimal business. Right. This year, we visually identified 221 ship-to-ship oil transfer sessions in the Real Archipelago. So this is tankertrackers.com. This trade is up by more than double for the same time period last year on account of a continued surge in oil exports by Iran. So this is an answer to the first Russian oil tanker attempting to deliver crude while under US sanctions made a secret cargo transferred to another ship, so on and so forth. This kind of thing is happening an awful lot. So while the sanctions are in place and while Russia is struggling to get rid of its gas because the infrastructure is much more complicated for gas, you either need to turn it into liquefied natural gas or turn it into a liquid and then whack it on a ship and take it abroad. But you need the infrastructure to do that. And in sanctions, I think it's unlikely that Russia are able to build decent infrastructure, although I'm sure China are helping. And other than that, you need pipelines, massive pipelines that take like 10 years to build. So that's not something you can do right now, which is why they're getting these old, Kazakhstani pipelines going again and trying to put more gas through that at not very great prices. But what they can do is transport oil because it's liquid much more easily, but it's all done dodgily. So it's about these ghost ships and turning off transponders and transshipments and transferring it from one vessel to another in the dark with your eyes closed, etc., etc. So Russia is still heavily involved in these very shady practices. Now, I love this. If you are not so much Americans, because you go on holiday much closer to the US for obvious reasons, and you've got the Caribbean very close, and Mexico, and the US itself is so massive, you just go on holiday in the US. But in the UK, we generally travel a lot around Europe, and one of the places we go is Turkey. But actually, Turkey has done for many years now, has a huge Russian tourist, is a huge Russian tourist destination. And they are, because Turkey speaks out both sides of their mouth, but it's also a place where Russian money is laundered very successfully. Anyway, this is brilliant. This has happened in Turkey. I don't know who did this, but our Russian flag is covered with shit. Why such an attitude towards Russians? Asked this Russian tourist. I wonder why. The first day of vacation, the Russian tourists in Turkey was pretty crappy. Russian tourists came to Turkey and proudly hung their flag in a hotel. The hotel guests did not appreciate such a patriotic impulse and smeared the flag and all their clothes with feces. Ouch. Yeah, what happened here? So hello guys, we arrived in Turkey today and hung a Russian flag on a tree next to our room, says your man, because that's what you do, if you don't want anyone, if you just want to just have a nice quiet holiday. We're Russian. I don't know why this is happening, but our Russian flag has been smeared with feces. Our entire balcony and all our sunbeds were covered in feces too. Here's a baby's nappy covered in feces. All our clothes are covered in feces. I mean, it's horrible. It's not a nice thing to do. But if you're going to say, well, guys, what do we have to do? We're Russians. Why do we come here? And why are we treated like this? Let's do something about this already. Of course, we will contact the hotel management. It's just this question. We're Russians. Why do we come here and are treated like this? I mean, I can't think. Why are we treated like this? Anyone got any ideas? Why are we treated like this? Your country is involved in genocide, and you appear to be supporting it by holding, proudly flying a flag outside your room. And thus, by extension, you are somehow morally justifying genocide, which makes you a moral monster and makes people want to fling feces in your face. Yeah, but why us? What have we done? Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe and share. I appreciate all your support. Thanks to members. Big love to all of you guys who help out so much and through Buy Me a Coffee and PayPal, etc., etc. Really appreciate that. And as far as I did say this the other night, JR is working really hard on this, but hopefully myself, hopefully Prof. Gerdis and Greg Terry, we're going to be starting up some fundraising with regard to a NAFO truck. But this is in the early stages and we're not sure whether we are definitely going to do that, but it's looking fairly positive, which would be really cool. Anyway, I'll let you know about that as it happens. Take care, speak soon.